All right, we've got the new AP poll top 25 out. And the big game between Michigan and Ohio State that saw the Wolverines win by 6 has the Buckeyes dropping 4 spots down to 6, with Texas and Alabama still trailing the Buckeyes in the poll department. Washington does move up, as well as Florida State. Florida State getting it done with Nate Rodemaker at quarterback against Florida at the Swamp. And then taking a look at the college football playoff rankings with Tuesday and then Sunday installments left to go in the season. Ohio State losing at 2, and of course Louisville ahead of their game with Florida State losing against Kentucky. All right, let's break things down. I've got Brady Quinn with me on set and Jerry Palm, our college football playoff analyst, joining us here on CBS Sports HQ. By the way, with Washington and Oregon both in the top 5, gives the Pac-12 2 top 5 teams for the first time since 2016, which was the last time the Pac-12 got a team into the college football playoff, with Chris Peterson and Jake Browning, who's now playing for the Bengals here on Sundays. Brady, I'll start with you. You were in Ann Arbor for the game of the year in the Big Ten and arguably in college football up to this point. What were your takeaways of the Wolverines' win?
Just the perseverance they've really showed throughout the course of the season. I mean, this was a team that coming into the game, they were missing some players the week prior. Obviously did not have Jim Harbaugh as their head coach. Sharon Moore has taken over. And up until this past week's game, I thought maybe wearing the hat as the head coach, as the offensive coordinator, as the O-line coach, started to wear on him a little bit in regards to the play calling in Penn State as well as Maryland. But I really felt like he was the difference versus Ohio State. His aggressiveness, in particular the play calling on 4th down, the decisions to go for those 4th downs, the halfback pass came at a very timely moment. And that, to me, was one of the biggest differences outside of the couple of interceptions that obviously gave Michigan points early and then sealed the game for them at the end. But give Sharon Moore, that staff, this Michigan team a ton of credit for the way they've been able to handle what has been described as a tumultuous season.
Jerry, let me turn to you, because a lot of people viewed this game as sort of a playoff eliminator, if you will, and the voters dropped the Buckeyes down to 6th overall. That's mirroring something that you have as well. Take me through the thought process of the fallout from Michigan and Ohio State.
Yeah, well, obviously Michigan will move up to number 2. Ohio State is going to have a problem getting into the college football playoff. I believe any one-loss team that doesn't win their league this year is going to have that problem, because we have so many teams that are 0 or 1 loss near the top of the field now, and many of them are going to be conference champions, and that's a tiebreaker for this committee in their criteria. So, you know, if you've got 4 conference champions that's sitting there with 0 or 1 loss, it's going to be hard for Ohio State to get into the college football playoff. I think they'll show up around 6 this week. You've still got 1-loss teams in Oregon and Texas, Alabama. You know, Texas will be ahead of Alabama, as they have been all along, because of the head-to-head result. I think Ohio State's going to slot in 6, but if Texas wins, they're going to jump them. If Oregon wins, they're going to stay ahead, and Washington at 12-1, even though they didn't win their league, might also stay ahead. So there's not a lot of upward mobility for Ohio State, regardless of where they end up in the rankings this week.
Yeah, I'm with Jerry. Unfortunately for Ohio State, I don't think they have any shot, really. Unless there's complete chaos, maybe they'd find their way in. But I think they're on the outside looking at the playoff. This is now about which New Year's Six bowl they would potentially go to. What's more interesting about at least the AP poll, and if the college football playoff mimics this, is sitting there at 6, being a spot ahead of Texas. And I know Texas is going to play in the Big 12 championship game. They have the chance to leapfrog Ohio State and get above them. But it does make you wonder how high that ceiling is, because if the top 4 in the AP poll, which are those 4 undefeated teams, which are chalky with the exception of the Pac-12 game, which is kind of interesting to get into, if they all went out, though, they all go. I mean, that top 4 right now you see in the AP and probably in the college football playoff is what you're going to see play for the national championship, if it all holds true. And the Big 12 in Texas would be on the outside looking in.
So, Jerry, let me just follow up with you and clarify maybe what the sense is here, that, you know, the voters have moved them down to 6. The argument could be made, why not just move Ohio State behind Bama and Texas if the upside is higher with those 2 programs? So do I get the sense that this is sort of a placeholder given the current resume of the Buckeyes, but knowing that a Texas or an Alabama could easily leapfrog them because of the conference title game that's still ahead?
The College Football Playoff Committee does not think ahead. They don't project ahead. So they are looking at what these teams have done so far this season and ranking them where they think they should be at the end of this week. Next week is a different problem. I project ahead. That's my job. That's not their job. So they're not going to think, well, you know, they'll just be ahead of them next week anyway. That's not what they're thinking. They're thinking, based on what you've done so far, where do you belong?
Okay.
And you're grading based off losses, right? If we're kind of looking at who you lost to and when and all that, Ohio State obviously losing to Michigan. If you're looking at between Texas's loss to Oklahoma, Alabama's loss as well this season to Texas, you're saying that's probably the best of those one losses that we're talking about in this scenario right now.
So obviously this is conference championship week, and I've got a couple of games that have the playoff implications, and I'm asking Jerry a different question. Brady, just start with you here. Georgia and Alabama in the SEC. Kirby Smart and company 5.5-point favorites over Nick Saban. What are you thinking? Early leans on this game here.
Yeah, early lean as you lay the points with Georgia. And I know they had a close call this past week, but as did Alabama in the Iron Bowl. Remember, a team in Auburn who lost the previous week to New Mexico State. So this will be a tight game. I mean, both these teams are improved over the course of the season. I think Alabama's offense is probably one of the more improved sides of the football and all of college football this year, despite their struggles last week versus Auburn. Maybe they were kind of looking ahead a little bit, but they got the job done in the end with a miraculous play on 4th and 31 or 4th and goal. I think that number is about right between these two teams. But the way I'm looking at it, Georgia is the best team in college football this year. I would lean heavily on them being able to take care of Alabama.
And Jerry, there are going to be, of course, some external factors. But for instance, again, because people will be talking about it, if somehow Alabama beats Georgia, what would the fallout be for both teams and their college football playoff chances, you think?
Well, the committee has always respected when one-loss teams have a head-to-head matchup, the winner ahead of the loser. That's why Texas is ahead of Alabama and has been this entire season. If Alabama beats Georgia, Alabama's going to be ahead of Georgia. But it doesn't mean that Alabama's going to jump Texas. They need Texas to lose if they're going to get some upward mobility. So, in fact, both of those teams could get left out depending on what happens. If Alabama beats Georgia, obviously if Georgia wins, they're in, they're number one. Alabama will be out in one of the other New Year's Six games. But Alabama beating Georgia, there are reasonable scenarios, favorites winning, where Alabama and Georgia both get left out.
Yeah, it's interesting to think that would be the case. I have a hard time believing that's ever going to be the case. The SEC champ, especially a one-loss SEC champ, wouldn't make it in this case. But there is that glaringly obvious point of Texas beating Alabama in Bryant-Denny, staring you square in the face. And how could you possibly put Alabama ahead of Texas in that case? I think two things. One, different Alabama team than what we saw earlier in the season. Again, this offense is much better. Tommy Rees has done a tremendous job helping Jalen Milroe get comfortable. And the other thing is, you'd arguably make the case that's the best win of anyone this season, is being able to beat Georgia, a team that's been pretty dominant this year. So I think there'd be rationale and justification for it. And there's always those caveats within the College Football Playoff Committee, throwing out some of the things that we tend to use as justifications in some cases and not so much as others. And that's where you hear the word the eye test come into play. If you watch Georgia from start to end this season and Texas from start to end this season, you would say Georgia's been, by and large, the better team between the two. So, look, their job and their task ultimately with getting the best four teams to play for the national championship. So regardless of what is written in the criteria, the playoff committee is going to find a way of putting those best four teams together.
So the SEC championship is on CBS on Saturday. On Friday, we get the Pac-12 championship, Jerry. And I've heard this through game broadcasters throughout this past weekend that the Pac-12 champion will get in. Now, we know if Washington stays undefeated, that's sort of a fait accompli. But if Oregon is able to win, which they're now 8.5-point favorites, what do you think in terms of the Pac-12 fallout?
Yeah, I think if Oregon wins, they'll get in. There'll only be 3 undefeated teams left. That's all the teams that will finish ahead of Oregon. If they win this game, Oregon, to me, is clearly the best of the one-loss teams, and they would be the 4th-place team in that scenario. And, of course, they could open the door for other teams to crawl in if they can upset those teams that are ahead of them, like we just talked about with Alabama. So we'd have to wait and see. But Oregon, to me, is the one-loss team that has its own fate to the college football playoff in its own hands.
If you're looking at the eye test, Oregon's the second-best team in the country in my mind. After Georgia, I think it's Oregon with the way they played the season. Now, I know they've got that one loss to Washington on the road, a tight game, which ultimately, you look at some of the decision-making of Dan Lanning that I think kind of stepped in the way of that. Take the field goal before half, maybe a couple other decisions down the stretch. Different outcome for that game, but without that one loss, you're looking at their resume too in comparison to a team that is undefeated in Michigan, saying Oregon's probably played just as equally difficult of a schedule, if not more so maybe when it's all said and done. So I'm with Jerry. I mean, I think if Oregon wins, they're in. What's more surprising is the fact that a team that beat them earlier this season is an 8-point underdog so far. I mean, this Washington team is getting back to full strength. They show more balance running the football. Defensively, there's definitely some concerns, but 8 points between two teams that scored off earlier, only a 3-point margin of difference. That's a bit surprising to me.
Yeah, and we're breaking it down throughout the week, of course. And then lastly, we have to talk about Florida State. Gentlemen, of course, getting that win against Florida at the Swamp. Brady, I'll start with you and then talk about Jerry. What did we learn about Mike Norvell's team, Jordan Travis, who was in the building to watch them there with Tate Rodemaker, the backup, getting it done?
Well, look, they're resilient. I mean, I think we saw Tate Rodemaker make enough plays in order to help Florida State win. But if we're being honest with ourselves, with the way all these teams look kind of down the stretch, they're the one that worries you the most. And if they do win out and beat Louisville in the ACC championship game, they're going to get in. But would I make the case they're not one of the 4 best teams? I don't think so, based on what we've seen so far. And that's not an indictment, too, on the fact that Jordan Travis isn't there. I just think you look at their resume and what they've done so far. You look at some of the other teams that they'd be up against or competing against to go, and I don't know that anyone would feel as comfortable about saying Florida State's better than those teams. So the reality is, if they're undefeated, they're going to go, but we could see a matchup where it's not so competitive depending on how things look in that semifinal game.
Jerry, let me give you a final word on the Noles then, and if they're able to get in, also there's a conversation to be had. For instance, if Michigan wins through, Georgia wins through, and Oregon beats Washington, then would you have a scenario where it would be the Ducks at 3 and then Florida State, which is still undefeated, so stays heady at 4?
I suppose that could happen. They won't leave them out, but they could make them 4. I guess you could maybe make a case for that. It's interesting because, Florida State, they didn't have their quarterback, obviously. They're not going to have Travis, but they actually had a better result against their in-state rival than Alabama did, which needed basically divine intervention to beat a similar quality Auburn team. Georgia, 8-point win over Georgia Tech, which isn't as good as either Florida or Auburn, but we're picking at Florida State because they're without their quarterback. I think that Florida State probably ends up 3. The committee could make them 4 if Oregon wins, but I expect the undefeated teams to be at the top.
It wasn't like Florida had their starting quarterback either, though. Let's pump the brakes on that a little bit, Jerry. It wasn't necessarily an apples-to-apples comparison. But
all right, yeah, but we got to get to Sunday, of course, and we still have Tuesday night to get through in the meantime. Brady, certainly appreciate it. Jerry, thank you as always. Taking a look at the notable top 25 movement. Again, a lot of the big hitters, of course, Louisville losing against Kentucky certainly hurts a little bit in terms of the ACC championship matchup. Also, big note here, James Madison looks like they'll be going bowling. Of course, they didn't have that perfect season to try to get the New Year's Six bowl bid, but they'll still have a chance to play in the postseason there in college football.